Welcome, everyone. We will begin in 1 minute. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Office of Block Grant Assistance at HUD, I want to welcome you to the Co-Managing CDBG-CV and CDBG-DR webinar. Next slide, please. I will start with just a few housekeeping notes. This is a PowerPoint presentation and a webinar recording. It will be available on the HUD Exchange. Participants will be in listen-only mode. Closed captions can be viewed using the Show Captions feature provided below. Consult the attendee guide for more information available on the resources page of the event website. Next slide, please. Questions. Submit content-related questions using the Q&A feature located below the video player. You may need to scroll down the web page to view the Q&A. You are encouraged to submit questions throughout the presentation. You do not need to wait till the end of the presentation to submit questions. Next slide. For technical issues, request assistance through the chat box on the right side of the screen. Additionally, questions relating to technical issues can be emailed to the email provided below. Next slide. I am joined today by Tennille Parker, Director of Disaster Recovery and Special Issues Division in HUD. Next slide. Before we make this presentation and address your questions, I'd like to take a brief overview. Why this topic? Communities are recovering from disasters as well as responding to COVID-19. In recent years, communities across the nation have been impacted by a wide range of major disasters. Over 60 communities are recovering from such disasters while also responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Many grantees might want to co-manage both programs. Strategically, it makes sense to manage the programs in a coordinated fashion, but how can that be effectively accomplished? Next slide, please. Today's agenda will focus on program similarities and differences, typical activities, opportunities, include a Q&A, and provide resources. Next slide, please. I'll begin by highlighting the common foundation that both the CDBG-DR and CDBG-CV programs share. Next slide, please. What are similarities? Based on CDBG in response to an emergency, disaster, fires, hurricanes, flooding, etc., public health, national objectives must be met. Cross-cutting federal regulations apply. Expenditures under each program must, 1, be CDBG eligible activities as per 24 CFR Part 570, including any applicable waivers. 2, meet a national objective, and last but not least, be in compliance with cross-cutting federal regulations. Next slide, please. There are lots more similarities. Duplication of benefits apply. There's the tieback and the waiver. Duplication of benefits occurs when a person, household, business, government, or other entity receives financial assistance from multiple sources for the same purpose, for the same time frame, and the total assistance received for that purpose is more than the total needed for the assistance. Use of both CDBG-DR and CDBG-CV must tie back to the significant events that prompted the Congress to approve special appropriations of CDBG-related funds. HUD published a Federal Register notice to provide guidance for the authorized uses of the funds, including details about the tieback requirement and any waivers from the CDBG requirements. For example, the CDBG-CV waiver eliminating the 15% cap on public services was published in the Federal Register. Next slide, please. So what are the differences? CDBG-DR. While both CDBG-DR and CDBG-CV must tie back to the significant events, the requirements are slightly different. A CDBG-DR funded recovery program must respond to the types of locations of needs resulting from disasters' direct or indirect impact, most impacted in distressed areas. And that planned response is described in a needs assessment, which quantifies the disaster's impact and the estimated cost of recovery. A grantee identifies gaps in funding that can be filled with the use of the CDBG-DR grant. Related recovery activities are then designed to meet those unmet needs based on that assessment and public comments. A grantee publishes its action plan and ties the recovery activities to the detailed needs assessment. Next slide, please. What are the differences? CDBG-CV. No comprehensive needs assessment is required for CDBG-CV. Because of the ongoing nature of the pandemic, it is not possible to fully quantify the event's direct and indirect impacts, nor estimate the total cost of the recovery. The CARES Act requires that each CDBG-CV funded activity must prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. Next slide. Typical activities. Understanding how CDBG-DR grants have typically been used and how CDBG-CV funds can be used will help us to better recognize the potential for co-managing the two programs. Next slide, please. How CDBG-DR is used. The above activities are typical of those that have been undertaken with the CDBG-DR grant funds. Each is required to directly or indirectly tie back to the event that resulted in the disaster declaration. Both housing and public facilities needs are often addressed. DR public services can include helping people sort through their assistance options. Special economic development activities can, depending on the location, include financing for large-scale commercial and industrial development for a broad set of economic revitalization initiatives. This may include, but is not limited to, the development or redevelopment of commercial projects, mixed use, and infrastructure. Next slide, please. How CDBG-DR is used. Federal Register notices governing CDBG-DR funds generally require grantees to primarily address unmet housing needs. CDBG-DR may also fund, repair, or reconstruction of public facilities and improvements, including features to increase resiliency. A certain percentage of every grant must be expended for activities that benefit low and moderate income persons in the most impacted and distressed areas. The primary focus of CDBG-DR activities is to address unmet housing needs. This includes the rehabilitation of damaged units, new constructions, and buyout programs. CDBG-DR can fund the repair, reconstruction of public facilities and improvement. It is important to note that a certain percentage of every grant must be expended for activities that benefit low and moderate income persons in the most impact and distressed areas. Next slide. How CDBG-CV is used. CDBG-CV funds may be used for CDBG eligible activities that tie back to the pandemic. That is to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19. To date, the most typical of those activities include public service activities, economic development activities, housing-related activities, public improvements in facilities, real property acquisition, and general administrative and planning activities. Activities must benefit residents within the jurisdiction of the grantee or as permitted by the CARES Act. At least 70% of every grant must be expended for activities that benefit low and moderate income persons by providing a public service, housing access to new or significantly improved infrastructure, or a permanent job. The remaining 30% may be used to eliminate slum or blighted conditions, or to address an urgent need for which the grantee certifies it has no other funding. Next slide, please. As with CDBG-DR program, HUD has issued special guidance through a Federal Register notice that was published in August of 2020. The notice implements features of the CARES Act intended to enhance flexibility in response to COVID-19. Certain CDBG-CV funded activities can be carried out with added flexibility necessary to address the dangerous nature and extensive scope of the pandemic. Let's take a closer look at alternative requirements that permit such flexibility for 1, emergency grant payments, 2, business assistance, and micro enterprises. Next slide, please. Okay, how can CDBG-CV be used? Under the category of public services, CDBG-CV funds can be used to make emergency payments, as many grantees have done across the nation. Those payments have covered such items as food, clothing, housing, which includes rent or mortgage, and utilities. Recently, housing-related payments have begun to shift from rent to mortgage payments. Payments must be made to a provider, such as a utility company, on behalf of the individual or family. The simple table on this slide indicates a related alternative requirement, which permits emergency payments under CDBG-CV for up to 6 consecutive months, instead of the 3 consecutive months permitted by CDBG. It is also important to note that the public services cap, which limits spending on public services to 15% of CDBG resources, is waived for CDBG-CV. There is no such spending limitation on public service expenditures from a CDBG-CV grant. Next slide. CDBG-CV funds have also been used widely for both business assistance and micro enterprise assistance. Business assistance is typically offered to avoid job loss caused by business closures related to social distancing. Short-term working capital is provided to small businesses to enable them to retain jobs held by low and moderate income persons, or to retrofit their place of business to recover from the pandemic. Businesses comprised of 5 or fewer employees have received technical assistance as well as financial help to establish, stabilize, or expand micro enterprises. Such businesses often provide medical, food delivery, cleaning, and other services to support home health and quarantine. Next slide, please. Opportunities. The premise for identifying opportunities to strategically manage the program ties back to the events that caused conditions and needs that the 2 grant programs typically address, both the natural disaster and the coronavirus pandemic. present significant community needs that directly and indirectly arise from the event's impact. Widespread casualties, damages, emergencies, and economic disruptions left in the wake. Next slide, please. CDBG-DR activities. Unmet housing needs with a direct or indirect tie back to the disaster in question. This includes the repairs of homes damaged by the event that have repairs beyond the amount paid by other sources, such as insurance or FEMA. Buyout programs enables homeowners in high-risk areas to relocate to safer locations. Damaged public facilities can also be repaired and made more resilient in the process to prevent damage from future events. Next slide, please. Okay. The pandemic has resulted in a strong push for non-congregate emergency shelters. This includes using CDBG-CV for the rental, acquisition, and in some cases, rehabilitation of motels or hotels used to provide housing for people experiencing homelessness. As we will discuss in more detail in a few minutes, CDBG-CV is conducted to small-scale economic development activities. Next slide, please. CDBG-CV for homelessness examples. Public facilities, as stated before, non-congregate emergency shelters, acquisition of hotels or motels to house people experiencing homelessness, public services, temporary hotel, motel sheltering programs, especially for homeless who are medically fragile or highly vulnerable. Emergency payments prioritized for homeless or those at risk. Recently exited from a HUD-funded rapid rehousing program. Currently in such housing or in HUD-funded permanent supportive housing with inadequate rental assistance. Next slide, please. CDBG-CV homelessness, California and King County, Washington. The state of California created Project Room Key to move people experiencing homelessness into hotels. They then created Project Home Key that funds the acquisition of existing motels to be converted to non-congregate shelters or public supportive housing. In April 2020, King County, Washington, moved more than 700 people out of high-density congregate emergency shelters and into single occupancy hotel rooms. A subsequent study by the University of Washington concluded the shelter de-intensification strategy, which limited the spread of COVID-19 among individuals moved to hotel locations as compared to those who stayed in congregate settings. The study also found that those in hotels experienced higher exits to permanent housing and indications of greater engagement with homeless housing services than those that remained in congregate shelters. Next slide, please. CDBG-CV for homelessness continued. No public service cap means that a higher percentage of total funding can be used for emergency assistance, especially for families facing eviction. Several grantees funded food distribution and some funded restaurants to provide meals to families in need. Each of those opportunities to use CDBG-CV funds can address housing and community development needs in response to the pandemic. Next slide, please. So early in the pandemic, HUD recognized the significant public benefit from the provision of assistance to stabilize or sustain businesses in jurisdictions that suffered disruption due to the coronavirus. Guidance in the Federal Register notice for CDBG-CV sought to facilitate business assistance. For this purpose, to avoid complete economic collapse within a grantee's jurisdiction, and now to foster its economic recovery. Therefore, CDBG-CV is more targeted to small-scale economic development activities than CDBG-DR. Examples include business assistance, services, and micro enterprises that, one, target central business districts, expand goods and services to core, and create incubators. Next slide, please. CDBG-CV for economic recovery continued. Location presumption of LMI status for job creation and retention. The higher poverty rate for central business districts is removed. Qualifying census tracts must meet either the 70% LMI requirement or 20% poverty rate and evidence of poverty and general distress. Next slide, please. Okay. As you may know, the normal job creation and retention record-keeping requirements consider family income when determining whether a beneficiary is a person of low or moderate income. But these requirements are likely to be burdensome during a time when unemployment has surged and family income is more difficult to document. Collection of income information directly from assisted businesses streamlines assistance. Grantees and employers may consider individuals that apply for or hold jobs to be members of one person's families for activities that prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. HUD also modified related record-keeping requirements by adding the additional presumption. HUD will consider the person income qualified if the annual wages or salary of the job is equal to or less than the Section 8 low income limit established by HUD for a one-person family. And the business may substitute records showing the type of job and the annual wages of a salary at the job. Next slide, please. Also, an alternative requirement modifies the so-called public benefit test for CDBG-CV funded jobs. Ordinarily, the test examines both aggregate and individual benefits. HUD waived the aggregate benefit test entirely and raised the individual benefit test. Specifically, the cost per FTE job is a maximum of $85,000, as shown on the table. The alternative also provides similar flexibilities for the provision of goods and services. Whatever the community development needs, a grantee can identify opportunities to separately use CDBG-DR and CDBG-CV funds. Those related activities might complement each other or more fully address an established need. Next slide. CDBG-DR and CV together. At the beginning of the webinar, it was noted that many grantees might want to co-manage both grants. Why would a jurisdiction that has received both CDBG-DR and CDBG-CV grants want to fund the same type of activities in the first place? A community's needs might have changed between the natural disaster and pandemic, or the reverse might have occurred. Conditions have evolved during the pandemic and presented similar difficulties in emergency response and recovery. The grantee's staff capabilities exist for related features and the demands of both grant programs, and the potential for duplication of benefit is manageable. Next slide. A grantee can prioritize rental assistance for households living in rental housing that received CDBG-DR assistance for repairs, or at least make sure the tenants or management of those developments are aware of the program. They are also able to do special outreach to homeowners receiving CDBG-DR funded repairs to make sure they are aware of any CV-funded mortgage assistance. For businesses that receive DR funding as needed, add CDBG-CV funded assistance to pay rent. If you are funding micro enterprises with DR, consider using CV to fund technical assistance. This can be especially important for micro enterprises since many do not have the expertise to maintain financial records that are often needed for assistance programs or borrowing money for business expansion. Next slide, please. CDBG-DR and CV together continued. One example would be a public facility being repaired with CDBG-DR funds that has seen its needs change due to the pandemic. CV funds can be used to address those additional needs. An example can include a need for an outdoor dining at a senior center being repaired with DR money, improved HVAC system that increases ventilation and includes technologies to remove or inactivate air contaminants. But you would have to remember that it is not permitted to reduce state or local funds budgeted for a project when learning that federal funds are available for the same use. Next slide, please. CDBG, DR, and CV together. Puerto Rico. Responding to coronavirus while still recovering from devastating hurricanes, CDBG-DR funded economic revitalization and recovery program. There's gap funding for large-scale commercial and industrial development. It includes development and redevelopment of commercial and mixed-use developments and infrastructure that supports economic investment. CDBG-CV funded micro enterprise assistance program focuses on businesses that provide medical, food delivery, cleaning, and other services to support home health and quarantine. It is also designed to complement larger scale DR funded activities. Next slide, please. Okay, so now is the time to address some questions. I do see that there may be some in the queue. If you have any questions that you would like to ask, I will have Duncan Yetman and Tanil Parker assist me with the answers.
I'm not seeing any questions in the queue right now. Chelsea, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Do you want to, while we're waiting for some questions to come in, do you want to go to the last slide that highlights some of the resources that we have?
Sure.
All right, great.
Okay. Provided are HUD links and resources that are available. The Disaster Recovery Tools and Templates Library, CDBG-CV Federal Register Notice, CDBG-CV resources, and there's also an FAQ available. Next slide, please. Additional resources available are, there is a co-managing disaster and recovery quick guide, a CDBG-CV PPR tieback flexibility, CDBG-CV duplication of benefits quick guide, and there are several webinars posted and available for viewing. Next slide, please.
I think that's the last slide.
Okay. I did also ask that links be provided for the attendees of this webinar. So you all would have access to additional links and documents.
Right. Two two documents that we did want to highlight, at least verbally, for you, that are also on the agenda page. They've been attached to the agenda page for Brand Live when you register. One of them is CPD Notice 1706, which covers the use of CPD funds in response to a disaster. And the other is the HUD Community Resilience Toolkit. Those are two very valuable resources for a CV grantee to utilize in conjunction with CDBG-DR, in conjunction with other CPD programs. HUD wants to make sure that you have the available resources to think outside the box, because obviously with a disaster, there is some thinking outside the box that's required. And if you've got DR funds, you're managing several disasters. You're managing the pandemic, which is a disaster in itself, and you're managing the reason for which you receive the DR funds. So please take advantage of all these resources that you see on these two slides, and also attach to the agenda for the conference.
I would also note for participants, the department recognizes the challenges of launching and implementing two consecutive grants, the CV and the disaster recovery grants. And this webinar offered the opportunity to find out how you can pair those resources, which is critical because there are some items that in the long-term recovery place, when we're talking about disaster recovery from a natural disaster, that aren't eligible. And thinking about households who are still temporarily displaced, and whether or not the CV funds may be a better resource for temporary needs versus your long-term recovery, homeownership, rental, development, et cetera. And so the opportunities for combining both resources definitely exist, as seen through the examples provided by other grantees. But we do recognize that from a staffing standpoint, it can be a challenge as you're trying to identify how to provide funds to your community while also adhering to both sets of regulatory requirements. And we hope that this conference and this webinar have been a tool that you can use not only for purposes of meeting the needs of your citizens, but also to assist with compliance and navigating the requirements of both funding sources.
Great, thank you, Tennille. I appreciate that. Okay, we do have a question in. Someone has asked for more examples of projects that could involve DR and CV funding.
So I'll speak to my disaster recovery grantees. Let's start with the flooding community. So for several of you, you experienced devastating floods in your communities within the last 2 years. And some of you are recently announced for funding for CDBG disaster recovery. In many cases, you are, based on unmet needs, likely going to have unmet housing needs, whether that's housing rehabilitation and repair, or the rehabilitation of multifamily. That's pretty hardcore in terms of Sticks and Bricks Community Development Block Grant disaster recovery resources. But one thing that's often forgotten are the actual needs of those households while they're waiting to be assisted with their DR funds, while you're waiting to get that contractor, while you're trying to do the procurement for the housing rehabilitation. They still have basic and temporary needs that very much could have arisen as a result of the pandemic. Things such as temporary needs related to rental assistance, things such as where will we place our things? We've experienced quite a bit of home turnover, and now we've been beset by a disaster. What about those temporary relocation expenses or the storage expenses. It could also be in the realm of expenses related to mental health and services. One of the things that is often cited in disaster recovery contexts are the significant mental health costs associated with households who have experienced a catastrophic natural disaster. Well, the pandemic did not lighten that load for those households. So those are opportunities to pair those services with households who are waiting to participate in your structural natural hazard disaster recovery programs.
Great. Thank you, Tennille. Duncan, do you have any examples or suggestions?
No, I think the housing one that Janelle provided is excellent in that the procurement process, the rebuilding process, new construction of housing process can be lengthy. It's lengthened even more by the circumstances surrounding the pandemic with regard to shipping delays and other things of that nature, the cost of materials, et cetera. So insofar as you can deploy CV resources while families are waiting for DR assistance, in the case of housing, whether it's for relocation assistance, whether it's for socially distant housing in a hotel situation or whatever you're looking at, these are some things to think about. Certainly you want to share any ideas that you have in that regard with your CPD field reps in terms of how you're going to be using CV, especially if this would require a substantial amendment to your original action plan for the use of CV funds. But if you have an idea to meet a need, discuss it with us, determine if that is something that CV funds can address. If there's a question about tieback, the reasonableness of that tieback to the disaster, by all means, have a discussion with your HUD field representative about that.
I would also add, Duncan, to the list of examples. In the context of public facilities, we mentioned in the CV context that may be an opportunity to make investments in facilities that can help address homelessness. But there's also those companion wraparound services. So thinking about, you have a disaster recovery household who's trying to navigate that application, you have the programs and services that you're funding with CV, perhaps consider a one-stop shop, a way to link those households with companion resources while they're waiting. And it's critical to think about the while they're waiting period, because that's where so many households, in fact, walk away from their disaster recovery opportunities. They've waited a while, they've submitted applications, whether it's rental assistance or homeownership assistance, and they're giving up. And this CV assistance may be a resource that they can use that helps them hold on a little longer, so that you can tee up your procurements, your housing rehabilitation, your agreements with landlords, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. I mean, our homeless assistance side of the house here in community planning and development at HUD, our Office of Special Needs and Assistance Programs, their experience has been that as rapidly as you can get folks who have experienced homelessness assistance as quickly as possible, the better the outcomes long term. So insofar as you can deploy those CV resources as quickly as possible, much quicker anyway than CDBG-DR resources, look at that. Look at the possibility of those wraparound services, of that temporary housing to make that happen for folks.
We've used several examples that include housing, but we're mindful that CDBG-CV funds, as well as disaster recovery funds, could be used for economic development. And when we're often talking about disaster recovery and economic development, we're focusing on small businesses, micro enterprises. It's those very same businesses that often find it challenging to navigate application processes and normal structural things around accessing disaster recovery assistance. Well, your combination and your use of CDBG-CV along with your long-term recovery economic development programs could really go a long way. That could include everything from investing in or providing grants or loans for mitigation resources. So helping that mom and pop move away from keeping their things in notebooks and coming up with different marketing strategies to match the comfort and safety concerns that the public has now. That could be a way of building capacity with smaller businesses who are struggling now, but also addressing the existing disaster recovery need, which is business hasn't been the same since their natural, or I should say their long-term catastrophic disaster in the natural disaster recovery sense. It could also be the technical assistance. So being able to deploy virtual resources and webinars and workshops to accommodate the fact that Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, many of these businesses are operating. And so they can't navigate some of the application resources that you may have available during the same hours where they're supposed to be staffing their businesses. And so providing optional, if you will, open hours that take place after the traditional 9 to 5 or 8 to 4 workday is very helpful. In addition, a way to support your business community, we've talked about the linkages between disaster recovery and CV. It could also include the types of expenses that are more temporary, but that allow those businesses to communicate that they remain open. And several of the jurisdictions have done those campaigns. They have provided health and safety materials for those businesses, things that perhaps would not normally be the things that we would look at in a long-term recovery standpoint, but are necessary to keep that business going till they can get to the more structural things like elevating their heating units that was damaged in a flood or that was completely destroyed as part of a wildfire, and navigating not only those challenges, but providing the technical support to do so. So just a couple of different ideas that combine the CV and the DR funds that can assist in the economic recovery, in addition to the housing examples that we cited earlier.
Right, and HUD understands that the pandemic has had a tremendous toll on those small businesses, especially in central business districts. And what Tennille is saying about the use of CV for working capital loans for whatever purpose, PPE, incentive payments to employees to enable them, to encourage them to stay on the job for at least a 6-month period, whatever may be needed by a small business or by a micro enterprise. Micro enterprises, in many instances, they need that technical assistance to help fill out the application for assistance, even to take away, as Tennille was mentioning, to stop keeping their records in a journal and put it into QuickBooks or into a computer software or something of that nature. So there's so much that can be done and provided to both small businesses and micro enterprises. And you should probably also think about them in the context of how to assist them, especially those businesses that may not have the opportunity to apply or the expertise or the capacity to apply for some of the other assistance that's been made available through the pandemic, through the Treasury Department, such as PPP and some of the other programs that the Treasury Department has had. So these are some of the things that you can think about in terms of using CV along with DR.
One thing that has been a frequent news story, and certainly something that communities have lived, which is employee retention and making the connection between how do we retain the employees we have, but also how do we recruit employees to staff some of the new things that we now have to do at this stage of the pandemic. That may include partnering with your local community colleges for offering structured courses and training for the public. And so using your resources to pay for some of that so that you are able to help those businesses recruit employees that have the skill sets needed for the jobs that they now have at this stage of the pandemic.
Right.
It can go even broader when you think about it in the disaster recovery context. These are also jobs that then are supporting your post long-term recovery economy. Perhaps it resulted in different types of businesses in your community than existed prior to the pandemic. But to sustain those operations, to sustain those businesses, it might take community resources, whether it's looking at transportation options, and that's your infrastructure with your disaster recovery funds, but the efforts of temporarily making sure that households who have been displaced or temporarily displaced by the respective disasters have a way to get into work again. And you often hear about that in the both immediacy of the disaster, but also where there are shortages in staffing for local public transportation resources. And so just thinking creatively of ways that allow these funds to support the businesses in your community, and thinking about the employees that the businesses already have and what their needs may be, but also the recruitment and hiring needs that those businesses may have. And the partnerships with existing community colleges and local chambers of commerce that many of you have already engaged in really go a long way here.
Yeah, it looks like we have a question that's come in.
Yes, we do. So Tennille, based on what you were saying, could CV funds be used to develop and implement continuity of operational plans?
Continuity of operations, those types of plans, yeah.
And I would venture the CV, the question was on CV. Well, that's also something that dives right into the DR purpose. We're trying to help communities become resilient with their disaster recovery funds and helping businesses, particularly smaller businesses, have plans for what happens in times of disaster when we don't have the same resources, when there are challenges with power. That's a perfect lineup with a long-term disaster recovery effort, because you're trying to ensure if our community experiences this disaster again, we won't have to shut down. We won't have to completely stop the services that we have. So definitely a great question, and it aligns very well with the long-term recovery effort.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tennille. I do not have any further questions.
We solved everyone's problems, Tennille.
Hey, there are many residents and businesses in our communities that need these funds, so that's great.
Okay, here's another question. I knew that statement would get somebody to ask a question. Here we go. You want to read this one, Chelsea?
Yes. Would you be able to provide an example you've seen or heard of where CDBG-CV funds became unallowable? Because of COVID-19's effects, it just seems like anything can be a PPR related activity.
Okay, yeah. So I would refer you back to the CDBG-CV notice that came out in August of 2020. Specifically in that notice, we talked about the direct effects of the pandemic and the indirect effects of the pandemic. The direct effects are obvious to many of us, right? The indirect effects, not so much. So what you have to think about is that tieback based on indirect effect. And as we have been saying all week, since Monday and since the onset of the basically CDBG course on Wednesday, the three most important things you can do is to document. You're going to need to be able to document that tieback, that PPR tieback, to prepare, prevent, and respond to coronavirus within what you're proposing to do. And it could be any number of things, but it needs to meet that tieback documentation has to be necessary and reasonable. We had a question the other day that came in about redoing a bathroom. This was a restroom at a homeless shelter, and there was a description given of how this restroom was set up, and they wanted to gut the whole thing and reestablish it so that there were individual restrooms within this restroom, essentially. Well, if you go into most businesses, businesses are, first of all, limiting the number of people in a restroom at any given time. And they're also, at least here in the HUD building, they're saying, only this sink is available due to social distancing requirements. So those types of PPE restrictions on the use of a restroom facility, those are reasonable and doable. Would it be necessary to completely dismantle the entire restroom and gut it and put in, for a restroom that previously served a maximum of 7 people, 7 sinks and 7 facilities? That's where you have to make a judgment call as to whether that is considered necessary and reasonable, right? So, and use, the reasonable person standard. Would a reasonable person consider that the use of federal government funds to completely gut this facility to meet, at a great expense, to meet social distancing requirements, would that be reasonable? Or is it just maybe we tell people, every third stall or every second stall you can't use, or every other stall has been shut down because of coronavirus to maximize social distancing within that facility? So these are the kinds of things you have to think about while you're putting together your plans and your set of activities. Those are all, we'd like to be able to do the sun, the moon, and the stars, but you have to think about the money that's available to you and, are those costs reasonable? They may be allowable, but are they reasonable? So I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that, Neil.
Actually, I did not. I noted that we had an additional question. How long are CDBG funds available to subrecipients? I believe the last presenter indicated 8 years. Can you point me to the resource that identifies 8 years? And I'll answer this both in general and then go to my CV colleagues. If you are a subrecipient of disaster recovery funds, so CDBG-DR funds, your subrecipient agreement governs the length of time you have for dispersing and completing the activities for those funds. In addition, several of the recent CDBG disaster recovery grants, so stretching back from 2016 through present, also have a HUD-imposed disbursement deadline of 6 to 12 years. Mitigation grants, 12 years, CDBG disaster recovery grants, in most cases, they're 6 years. And so that state, city, or county who has received those funds will have that amount of time, the 6 to 12 years for CDBG disaster recovery or mitigation, and then they'll likely pass on to subrecipients through a subrecipient agreement, a time period that's slightly less than that because they want to have time to do reconciliation and final closeout with you. So with that, I'll turn it over to my CV colleagues to answer in the context of CV.
Sure. So the 8-year requirement, you're probably thinking about the 8 years that grantees have in the annual formula CDBG program to receive an obligation of funds and then expend those funds. That's an 8-year time frame that's been dictated to HUD by the National Defense Authorization Act. With regard to CDBG-CV, it is a 6-year requirement to expend the funds. Again, that's a grantee, not a subrecipient. Subrecipients are guided by the subrecipient agreement, much like in the DR program. They are, there is a statement of work which indicates the schedule for the activity, the budget, what has to happen, what the rights and responsibilities of each of the parties are throughout the course of the agreement, how that agreement is terminated, how the agreement is still in effect or remains in effect while funds are still available or program income is still available. So as a subrecipient, you're looking mostly, not exclusively, but you're looking mostly to the subrecipient agreement for guidance on fund availability. So do we have any more questions coming in?
Great. No, as of now, Duncan, there are no further questions.
Okay, I think we just want to reiterate then at this point, we have only a few minutes left until 5 o'clock. We can just reiterate at this point the resources again that are available, the quick guides, the webinars on economic development and subrecipient management. There is on-call technical assistance available for CV. If you have a question about using your CV funds, those technical assistance resources in the Ask a Question portal in the HUD Exchange are available. And also, don't hesitate to reach out to your local HUD field office and your local CPD rep for assistance.
And similarly, for those who are now well-versed in CDBG-CV, but perhaps newer to disaster recovery, HUD's online resources, as well as the staff in CPD field offices, are a great resource. The HUD information on disaster recovery on the HUD.gov or the HUD Exchange sites have every set of Federal Register notices that have rules for the CDBG disaster recovery funds, as well as prior training and webinars that you can take advantage of to help build capacity and find out how DR maybe could be used in ways that you had not contemplated. I would also note that there's a series of training for some of our attendees. Perhaps you are in our 2020 disasters class and awaiting your set of rules. There's a set of training that will be launched in 2 weeks that is specifically focused on that resource. And perhaps you'll want to revisit then these training seminars and content to figure out how, in your efforts to respond to your more recent disaster, you can also use your CDBG-CV funds as part of your long-term recovery efforts.
Great. Great. I think with that, we can end today's session on co-managing disaster recovery and CARES Act programs. Thank you, everyone. And please stay tuned for the next session on monitoring subrecipients.